Welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Andy Clarno. I teach at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I'm an organizer with Sociologists for Palestine. Happy to welcome you to our panel, Boycott, the Palestine Exception and the Crisis of Democracy in the ASA. We come to you tonight as conditions in Palestine continue to be horrifying, with ongoing daily attacks in Gaza that have killed over 72,000 people since 2023, including 738 since the so-called ceasefire was signed in the fall, and 32 just in the last 14 days. There are constant raids and settler violence in the West Bank, alongside the approval of 34 new settlements in the West Bank, bringing the total official new settlements since 2022 to over 100. Palestinians continue to resist. They continue to show samud, the steadfastness of remaining in place, refusing to leave. We've even seen in the last couple of days the emergence of a makeshift university in Gaza that's rising from the rubble. Alongside this, as you all know, we have a crisis of democracy within the American Sociological Association. The original purpose of this panel was to discuss the S4P member resolution signed by 428 ASA members, which should have been voted on by council, and if council didn't approve it, should have ended up on the ballot that we all received today. The purpose was to inform, members of the American Sociological Association about why S4P put together a resolution calling for an institutional boycott of Israeli universities. Why are we calling for a boycott of the universities? And to just open up a conversation with ASA members on the day that the ballot comes out. But we've had to shift focus because, as you all know, on March 12th, the ASA president and executive director issued a letter to all ASA members decreeing that they would not put the resolution on the ballot, that it was not petitionable. Since that time, there's been a pretty widespread pushback on the ASA. Members have been writing and responding. The Sociologists for Palestine put forward a series of demands, including that the resolution be put on the ballot that was circulated in April, and that the ASA also introduced a bylaw amendment to remove the ambiguity that's being used to suppress member petitions like this one. The chairs of different sections have been organizing and have sent 2 letters to the ASA Council calling on them to address the crisis of democracy. One of the letters explicitly said that ASA Council should put the S4P resolution on the ballot. There's been silence coming from the ASA leadership in response to all of these mobilizations. And today, we all received our ballot and there was nothing there, right? The absence of the resolution speaks volumes. So when presented with an opportunity to change directions, to open a pathway to member participation, instead the ASA leadership has decided to double down on repression and suppressing this member resolution. So today we've announced, Sociologists for Palestine announced that we will move forward with the decision to boycott the ASA 2026 annual meeting in New York City. And that means that this panel, right, while focusing on the academic boycott of Israeli universities, will also be dealing with the crisis of democracy within the ASA. We have 4 outstanding speakers. We've asked them each to speak for 5 to 7 minutes as opening comments. Then we'll have some time to a moderated discussion. And we encourage everyone here to raise questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. There are several S4P organizers here who will be able to answer those questions, and we will, we want this to be engaging. We want this to be an opportunity for us to learn from one another, but also to begin to address the challenging questions that come with uh, a proposed boycott of the American Sociological Association meeting, right? We realize this won't be easy, and it presents real challenges, and we want to think through that together. So I'm going to introduce our four speakers. They'll each take a little time to share some opening thoughts, and we'll take it from there. The meeting is being recorded, so please keep that in mind. Yeah, and thank you all for being here. We really deeply appreciate the support that we've seen from so many ASA members and supporters across the country and around the world. And we look forward to this being the first of many conversations and opportunities to engage around these questions as we continue to press for justice in Palestine and democracy within the American Sociological Association. So thanks again for being here today. Okay, our first speaker tonight will be Iman Abdelhadi, who's Assistant Professor of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago, co-author with M.E. O'Brien of the outstanding, incredible book, Everything for Everyone, An Oral History of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2075, and working very hard on a new book, Impossible Futures, Why Women Leave American Muslim Communities While Men Stay. Next, Saida Grundy will speak. Saida is an Associate Professor of Sociology, African American and Black Diaspora Studies, and Gender and Women's Studies at Boston University, and the author of the award-winning Respectable: Politics and Paradox in the Making of Morehouse Men. Our third speaker tonight is Gay Seidman, the Martindale Bascom Professor of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin, and the author of several books, including Manufacturing Militants, Beyond the Boycott, and Engaging Eric Olin Wright, which she co-edited with our late colleague and comrade, Michael Borovoy. And finally, last but definitely not least, Howie Wynant, Distinguished Professor of Sociology Emeritus at UC Santa Barbara, founder and director of the UC Center for New Racial Studies, and the author of several books, including Racial Formation in the United States with Michael Omi, The World is a Ghetto, and Global Raciality, Empire, Postcoloniality, and Decoloniality, which he edited with Sunena Myra and Paula Bacchetta. So thank you all again for joining us in this webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend Iman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you all for being here with us today in this crucial moment. It's really an honor to be here with so many people that I admire and so many scholars whose work I have read, and also, just people I respect in the world, just not even just for their scholarship, but just for how they act as scholars and intellectuals. I want to say that what we have seen over the last 2 years is Palestine holding a mirror up to society, to the whole world, really, to the liberal world order, and in particular to American society, to the very society that has enabled the genocide of Palestinians. And that mirror has found us lacking. We are told that we are free, and yet we cannot protest on behalf of Palestine without getting dragged by the police. We are told we have academic freedom, and yet our talks get canceled, our events get moved, our colleagues get reprimanded or fired for their views on Palestine. We are told that we live in a democracy, and yet we are in a moment where 80% of Democrats have an unfavorable view of Israel, and yet the Democratic Party continues to support Israel unconditionally, pretty much. Even a recent Pew Research a poll just came out at the end of March, showing that even among Republicans, under 50, 57% have an unfavorable view of Israel. So we are in a moment where the American public is united in its critique of Israel and its criticism of Israel. And yet our institutions are unable to meet the moment, are unable to speak to their bases. And that is happening on the level of the polity. And it's happening at the level of even institutions like the American Sociological Association. Now, the interesting thing about being Palestinian is that you are told over and over that nothing, no form of resistance is okay, right? So the narrative is always that, if only Palestinians would ask nicely, if only they would pursue unarmed resistance. Well, let me tell you about an unarmed resistance technique that has worked in the past. It's boycott. It's boycott, it's divestment, it's sanctions. And the reality is that the Israeli state and allies of Israel have treated boycott as the existential threat that it is for them because it is effective, because it has the potential to actually change the status quo. And so it is treated with the same ferocity, right, as any other form of Palestinian resistance or any form of allyship to Palestine. Now, you might be thinking, why should we boycott Israel? There are so many reasons that people bring up, especially in the academic context. So people will say things like, what is this going to do? Well, first and foremost, our forms of allyship and our forms of resistance should be shaped by the requests of the people that are most affected. And this is what Palestinian civil society has asked of us. It has asked us to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel. That means that each of us who has an imperative to ask, what is it? Where is it? What associations, what groups do I have influence on? And how can I get them to meet that request? And for everyone in this seminar or in this webinar, our professional association is one of those venues. It is one of those venues where we can build power and mobilize. Um, Israeli universities, and another common thing that we hear is that, well, but our academics are not the problem, right? Academics are the good people, the liberals, the ones that we shouldn't alienate. Maya Wind, in an excellent book called Towers of Ivory and Steel, has demonstrated exactly how Israeli institutions, academic institutions, are deeply, deeply intertwined with the Israeli military structure and the Israeli government. The Israeli military institutions have been consistently on the side of apartheid, on the side of occupation, on the side of genocide. So it is the least that we can do to boycott these institutions. Another argument I've heard is, well, isn't this hypocritical because the US is so militaristic? The US does this, that, and the other. Well, again, our efforts should be shaped by what the request of the people that are affected is. This is an active boycott campaign. This is an organized material strategy. And let me tell you, Americans, we are behind. Boycott campaigns have been happening in Europe, in places like the Netherlands, in France, in Spain, in Italy. We are seeing more and more and more universities and professional associations commit to the boycott of Israel. And the reason that they are doing that is because it is a form of straightforward, unarmed resistance. We cannot, in this moment, treat everything like it's just another day, right? Israel will never, of its own accord, stop killing Palestinians en masse, stop building settlements, stop occupying Palestinian land. It has to materially be forced to do that. And the way that that happens is through isolation from its allies. This is not a boycott against individuals. This is a boycott against institutions. So when we say that the ASA should boycott, we are asking, right, for members of the American Sociological Association, members of our professional association, to do the bare minimum in support of a group who's being killed by our tax dollars. Now, the fact that we're in a moment where the ASA has chosen to overturn a member petition undemocratically, just as we are hearing all this talk about how the ASA is standing up for democracy, how sociology is important for building a better world, how it's important for defending democratic and liberal institutions. I mean, the irony is unbelievable. And so we are constantly seeing this idea that Palestinians are an exception, right? It is hard to imagine that this resolution would have been overturned if it were about the Ukraine, if it were about some other group that is not Arab and Palestinian and Muslim. So what the ASA is doing is reaffirming something that we know and as sociologists very well, which is that some people are treated like full human beings with rights and with yeah, who are grievable in Judith Butler's terms, right? And others are seen as not grievable and not defensible. And the ASA is deciding unilaterally that Palestinians fit in that latter group, in the disposable group. So to me, this is about returning to that idea of the mirror of society, right? If Palestine is holding up a mirror to our society and saying, you are being found lacking, the question is, what are we going to do about it? Um, we are in a moment where higher education is in crisis. We are in a moment where these organizations are in crisis. And I find it deeply ironic that our leadership would decide to make this organization irrelevant for a new generation, would decide to basically malign an entire new generation of sociologists rather than embrace the debate that is at the heart of democracy. So I really want to thank my colleagues and sociologists for Palestine for the work that they're doing. And I look forward to a robust conversation with all of us about how we can take back this organization that ultimately belongs to us, not to the president and the executive assistant.
Thank you, Iman. Next up will be Saida. Thank you.
Well, thank you, man. Though that was thank you for really for leading on that and just putting us in the exact right frame of mind. I want to talk about, I'm sorry, there's background noise. I want to talk about what this means for me in terms of the actual tool of boycotting, and then what organizational stances and organizational sort of defining lines mean in terms of my understanding of the history of movements. I've told this story before about my name, Saida, which every Muslim in in the world probably is like has a mother-in-law named Saida. So, but this was intentional. When I was born in 1982, my father, who comes out of the Black arts movement, who comes out of Black Power, he's a university man, right? And he saw his job as spending the University of Kentucky's money on things that affected communities of color, right? Spending it on, arts, spending it on Black independent films, plays, poetry, all this kind of stuff, right? And there was a group of Persian students who used to come to everything, and they were all grad students. And he notices them, and then one day they come to his office and they slam a tape recorder on his desk and they say, "We want to know everything about this Malcolm X. Like, start talking." Because they were planning their revolution. Some of them were imprisoned for that. Most of them could never go back to Iran. I was named Saida for one of those graduate students, right? He was Said. That's the story. And then he became like a godfather for me. My father's intentionality in that name was that I would know that Black people are not the only ones this has been done to. That I would know that ultimately Black liberation was anti-colonial liberation. That all over the world, these are our people, right? And so with that, I, simultaneously, as the Persian Revolution is happening, anti-apartheid is happening. And the power that I learned of the tool of boycotting was baked into my childhood. Divest, divest, divest. I don't think people, unless you were alive then, which is crazy that some of our colleagues, I'm old now, some of our colleagues were not alive at this time. when we remember that apartheid was really not a bellwether issue for the white American masses, right? Reagan called Mandela a terrorist. Apartheid was good for business. This is what the Boers always argued. It's good for business, right? Who started the divestment movements? Black longshoremen in Long Beach, California, right? Who refused to offload cans, the actual shipping cans coming from South Africa. We're talking about working class Black men, no college degree. They refused to offload these cans, right? The actual organized boycott and divestment movement in South Africa was a grassroots campaign. Ron Dellums, congressman out of the Bay Area. Ron Dellums, one of the OG Pan-Africanists in Congress. I don't even know where Pan-Africanists are in Congress anymore. This is a sad state of affairs. But that's who was pushing, right? Randall, I'm reading all the names, these OG, the Randall Robinson. Thank you, Kay. Thank you for the assist. Randall Robinson, right? We're talking about, again, these are all, Black power sort of, establishment figures. I think we all love to say, oh, yeah, apartheid was so bad. But in the moment, no one from US business to US elected officials, they were not taking stances against apartheid. It was a grassroots boycott. If I am a student of nothing in terms of history, I know that Black people who had no other form of enfranchisement in terms of democratic representation, in terms of rights to democratic participation, they voted with their feet and they voted with their money. They refused. They would either literally migrate away from a place, or they absolutely shut it down, right? They shut it down with their boycotts. Black women in particular knew the power of a boycott because Black women were the CFOs of their households, right? That is the tradition from whence I'm born. Manning Marable, the late great Manning Marable, our colleague in history, he said that history is a weapon, that it's not enough to do sort of scholarly navel gazing and to do scholarship for the sake of scholarship. This is not this is not politics as vocation, right? This is to use it as a weapon, and he trained his students to use history as a weapon against propaganda, against, false ideology, etc. With that, not only is the discipline our weapon, but the organizations behind it must be our weapon. To have politically innocuous organizations is, for me, it's complete complicity. I'll say it this way. When I was in undergrad and I somehow came to a conclusion, because, there's all this pressure when you're at a Black college, like, are you going to pledge? You going to pledge? No. My conclusion about not doing that is I said no, because when I look at the scope of this organization, I do not join organizations that are only important to themselves. That became my bar for my own morals. I do not participate in organizations that are only important to themselves. I can offend a million people with that statement, but I stand by it. You've been around for 100 years. If you were about Black liberation, where are your FBI files? When the point was just made, like, are we making ASA irrelevant for another generation? That is my fear. Have I committed my time and my identity and my name to an organization that is capitulating to being only important to itself? I also come from a tradition of people in which you have to jail us and kill us in order for us to capitulate our power. To see an organization roll over, to me, is egregious, right? So when we call for, a boycott of ASA, for me, that's an automatic. That's an automatic. You have not earned my dollar. And I never stayed in the hotel block anyway. I'll pass it on.
Okay, that is a really impressive thing to follow. I think that I was asked to talk about the history of boycotts more broadly, so I'm going to echo some of the things that Saida said, but I'm also going to take it a little further back because I think social movements have used consumer boycotts for centuries. The first one that I know of is the abolitionists in Britain who boycotted sugar that was grown on Caribbean slave plantations. But then there's also early workers in the United States who boycotted businesses and called on their communities to boycott businesses that didn't recognize unions. The 1950 civil rights boycotts, the UFW's Great Boycott, and these were all ways for local activists to put pressure on local governments and businesses. But I would say that transnational boycotts generally have been used, as Saida said, more to draw attention to stuff around and actually I think Imam said it as well, more to draw attention to international events around the world, to prompt conversations and raise awareness, less for structural power than for making issues visible. South Africa's anti-apartheid movement is an obvious example. I'm going to say you're right about the longshoremen, but I think it's also true that exiled South Africans were critical to the anti-apartheid movement, especially at the height of the Cold War, because these exiled activists were desperate to put pressure on Western governments because those governments refused to impose sanctions on white minority regime because South Africa had critical mineral deposits. It was geographically very strategic. So exiled activists did whatever they could to call attention to apartheid, from pickets outside major banks to protesting divestment movements on campuses, urging the United Nations General Assembly to declare apartheid a crime against humanity. Perhaps the most quixotic of these campaigns, and maybe my favorite, was the international sports boycott. In the early 1960s, Dennis Brutus, who was a famous South African poet who had spent time on Robben Island and then gone into exile, he sort of became the face of the effort to block South Africa from participating in the Olympic Games because they didn't allow Black South Africans to join their teams. Years later, Brutus told me that he never actually thought the campaign would get anywhere, but he was a rabid sports fan. So he knew who he was talking to. He figured it might make South Africa's racial policies more visible. To his amazement, the International Olympic Committee responded really quickly. And in 1964, they blocked South Africa's teams from participating in the Olympics because they wouldn't let Black South Africans be on the teams, which meant, especially I think the representatives from former colonies who had only just gotten independence at the time, 1964, they saw it as a gross violation of citizens' basic rights. You can't play on a team for your country. In 1970, South Africa was actually evicted from the International Olympics Commission, which definitely caught attention in South Africa as well as abroad, because there are lots of rugby and cricket fans in South Africa. But even though that campaign is considered a major success, it was actually the actual impact was really limited. Despite the Olympic ban, South Africa's major allies, Britain, the United States, France, New Zealand, and Australia, refused to join the boycott. So even though South Africa's teams couldn't participate in many international sports organizations, a lot of national sports groups just said, sports shouldn't be political, players shouldn't be punished because of their government's policies. So right through the 1980s, South African athletes, especially rugby and cricket, and some golfers, were able to tour the world to participate in games, even though the Olympic Committee had actually banned them. So yes, the sports boycott brought attention to South Africa's segregationist policies, especially to, I don't want to be rude about sports fans, but to audiences that might not have otherwise noticed. Similarly, there were European boycotts against South African wine and oranges. There were lots of divestment campaigns on university campuses, in city councils. There were many debates on corporate boards and with shareholders insisting that companies should cut ties with South Africa. But I worry, watching what's going on today, I worry that discussions of the transnational boycotts tend to focus on how to catch attention and overlook the dilemmas that the tactic sometimes creates. Boycotts do call attention to an issue, but they don't always open space for voices within organizations or from the community. In the early 2000s, many of you probably remember, student activists in the United States were hoping that consumer boycotts would push multinational corporations to start improving working conditions in subcontracted factories around the world, especially in the global South. Um, it was really difficult for those campaigns to make sure that workers' voices could be heard, especially because, in general, corporations were much less likely to empower workers than to create corporate social responsibility offices, which actually sometimes effectively weakened labor unions rather than strengthening them. To be fair, I think the anti-apartheid movement as a whole was really attentive to this, and as I think BDS is, they make sure that local voices are heard. Their goal was never to shun South Africa, but to end apartheid. It was about ensuring a transition to democracy, especially when domestic protests in South Africa surged in the 1980s. Most exiled most exiled leaders of the anti-apartheid movement tried to bring attention specifically to activists who were fighting inside South Africa against apartheid. So Bishop Tutu or Alan Boesak or union leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa, now president, and Jay Naidu. Um, with the universities, there was a boycott of universities, but global audiences were always encouraged to engage with anti-apartheid activists who worked at South African universities. Those individual voices were always recognized. Sociologists like Eddie Webster or Jackie Koch, legal scholars like John Dugard, who actually in the early 2000s became one of the first international voices to draw parallels between apartheid's racialized exclusion and Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, and who in 2024 was one of the people who presented South Africa's case against Israel at The Hague. I think for sociologists for Palestine, I think the dilemma about the boycott right now is more about how you deal with the ASA than it is about how we deal with universities in South Africa. I think we need to remember that boycotts generally emphasize exerting structural power on the corporation or on the university or on the organization from the outside. One of the things I share everyone's anger over the leadership in the ASA, but deciding to block a vote on a resolution that so many members have supported is outrageous. But I hope in today's discussion we'll think a little bit about what it will take to create how we create a broader debate within the ASA. I worry that by boycotting it, we lose our voices in the ASA and we lose the possibility of pushing it to change its possibility. I hope we can persuade the ASA's leadership to let us vote on the resolution. And if not, I think we should create a space either within the ASA or next to the ASA where we can debate these, where other sociologists can join us to discuss these issues. Thanks.
Okay. I'm very gratified to be here. Please forgive my sore throat that I have and my voice. I also want to give credit to Sociologists for Palestine, which has been a remarkable organization and a remarkable effort to develop a strong moral voice on this issue. Obviously, I oppose the Israeli wars on Gaza, the West Bank, Iran, Lebanon. I hope you do too. These are also U.S. wars. They're connected to repression in the in the U.S. We have to challenge them every way we can, especially in our own organizations and institutions. This resolution, to me, is a small but important way of doing that. We're not alone. Other professional associations are doing it too. And I do want to point out that over recent years, the ASA has approved and supported resolutions on such topics as same-sex marriage, the opposition to the war in Ukraine, obviously South African apartheid, and the Iraq War. So the claim that we are not within our province, that we're somehow out of bounds by raising this petition, raising this resolution, is patently incorrect. We're not proposing to boycott individual sociologists. This resolution challenges both the Israeli Sociological Society and U.S. collaborators in the genocide and apartheid that are the core Israeli policies. It challenges U.S. policy as well. To vote for this resolution is not only an effort to reject genocide and to support the Palestinians. It's not only an effort to support free speech and academic freedom in our own institutions. By the way, these do not exist, as Iman had said, these do not exist in Israeli universities, and they are endangered. As many of us know, they are endangered here in our own universities. A vote for this resolution is also a way to repudiate Trump and Netanyahu's cynical manipulation of American Jews. In the limited time I have, I want to say something to my Jewish colleagues in the ASA. There are a lot of us. Because I presume that many of the opponents of this resolution are Jewish. Not all, obviously not all. Many supporters of the resolution are also Jewish, as I am. I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. I'm someone who is active in Jewish Voice for Peace, and I'm active in the defense of higher education against the bogus charges of the largely bogus charges of anti-Semitism on campus leveled by the Trump administration. My parents were refugees from the Nazis. I was raised in a Zionist household. There are a lot of Jews like me, anti-Zionist, or at least questioning Zionism. What about us? Don't we count? We are a substantial proportion of the U.S. Jewish population. American Jews are not a monolith. No organization speaks for all of us. Not the ADL, not Hillel International, not the established Jewish organizations in the United States and abroad. Yet the zeal to control U.S. higher education, which Trump sees correctly as an obstacle to his authoritarian agenda. In other words, the university as an obstacle to anti-democratic authoritarianism, has weaponized the charge of anti-Semitism against the universities. I'm a race and racism scholar. I care deeply about anti-Semitism, but I believe it's best addressed by fighting all forms of racism, bias, and discrimination, not through making some kind of bizarre exception only for anti-Semitism. And indeed, most of the anti-Semitism in the United States, not all, I agree, but most of it comes from the right wing, from the Nick Fuenteses and the Groypers and the Candace Owenses and the Tucker Carlsons and the Heritage Foundation and the college Republicans. We have the receipts on this. Okay, a vote to boycott the Israeli Sociological Society is a vote against genocide and racism. The ISS and in Israeli universities also collaborate with these policies. That's been made clear. Iman Al-Bilkhadi made that very clear. Many U.S. universities collaborate too We can discuss that further in this forum if people wish. We do not want the ASA to collaborate. Palestinian universities, Palestinian scholars, including sociologists, Palestinian students have been destroyed, have been killed, wounded, tortured en masse by the Israeli policy of scholasticide, the attack on education, not only universities, but K-12, K-12 education as well. As of July 2025, so already a little out of date, the Palestine Right to Education campaign had documented that 130 professors, academics, scientists, and university presidents, along with members of their families, and more than 12,000 students had been killed in Gaza and the West Bank. Of course, this number is by now considerably higher. Israeli universities, including sociologists, are deeply involved in all this. And by the way, U.S. sociologists are too. You know who you are. The Pentagon, notably DARPA, works with numerous social scientists in Israeli universities and U.S. universities. Shared U.S.-Israeli projects involve AI, surveillance, military targeting, and policing, including torture. So we're talking about such fields as social psychology, criminology, social network analysis, political sociology, and various quantitative data analysis specializations, just for starters. Stop for a second and ask yourself, what do our studies mean? What is our field for? How can we justify this kind of collaboration? How can sociology ally itself with mass murderers at home and abroad, either by cooperating or by ignoring, willfully ignoring what they are doing? And don't kid yourself, many of us, and almost all the institutions where we work, cooperate with the U.S. war machine and the Israeli war machine as well. Harvard, the UC system, many others. Our students protested this in the encampments of 2024. Did we support them as faculty? Very, very poorly. The private sector is also deeply involved in this work, both in Israel and the US. Multinational tech firms, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, sorry, and others are very active in Israel and involved in state activities, many working with the IDF, the Israeli defense, so-called defense forces, the Mossad and other agencies. Sociologists work for all these entities. They get grants from them. Ben Gurion University is a notable case, but there are many others. Let me also share Iman's reference to Maya Wynn's fantastic book about the university complicity in Israel. I want to point to an article by an Israeli sociologist just came out named Roy Vidny, called The Sociologist as Bystander. Okay. We have to think about our profession's responsibilities. We cannot accept the excuses like we're not authorized by our bylaws or our nonprofit status. It's none of our business or similar excuses. This is what the ASA leadership is doing, looking at the other way at best and collaborating with mass murder at worst. They know exactly what's going on. Collaborating with enabling genocide and apartheid is not an acceptable situation for our professional organization. The threat that we will lose membership in the ASA by boycotting cuts both ways. We will boycott the ASA. The refusal to allow a vote is not only anti-democratic, it's a tacit collaboration with both these authoritarian states, Israel and the US. There can't be any excuse for not taking a stand. It's cowardly of the ASA leadership to keep a distance from all this. I don't want to get involved, is what a lot of people say when authoritarianism and fascism threatens. We must not collaborate with mass murder. Thank you.
Thank you, Howie. Thank you, Gay, Saida, Iman. Incredibly powerful comments. We really, really so much appreciate y'all being here. And there's so much here to unpack and to explore more. I will remind everyone to please keep posting questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Organizers have been responding already to over 20 different questions. They're fantastic questions. And these are things that we're grappling with, many of them, as organizers within S4P, and still trying to figure out some of the logistics. So the questions that you're asking are helping us think through what are the questions that we need to address, and it's things that we hope to be able to work on collectively, right, and to figure out together. So we will be adding some of these responses to our FAQs on the Sociologists for Palestine website. I encourage y'all to check out that website regularly. It's updated. The FAQs are very clear, and they provide answers to so many questions that people have about both the boycott of Israeli academic institutions, as well as the planned boycott of the American Sociological Association. I want to come back to the boycott of the American Sociological Association in a minute, but first I wonder if we can speak. We've been talking quite a bit here about Palestine, about Israel, and the war on Gaza, U.S. complicity. I want to raise up a point that Saida made, right, which is that Black liberation is anti-colonial liberation, right? And to think about the current conjuncture and the interconnections between the struggles in this particular moment, right? Because it's not just Palestine. We're seeing the violent attacks on immigrant communities across this country, right? ICE raids from Los Angeles to DC to Chicago to Minneapolis, and heroic resistance on the ground. In addition, right, we've seen the U.S., right, invade Venezuela, capture a president, and put him under arrest, invading Iran with Israel, right, while Israel is ramping up attacks on Lebanon and throughout the region. So I wonder if I'm going to pitch this question to our panelists, if you could speak to just for a few minutes about how the struggle for Palestinian freedom is connected to other struggles in this current conjuncture, so that we can, understand why when we talk about Palestine, we're not just talking about Palestine. We're also talking about, right, these deeper interconnected struggles for freedom and liberation throughout the world. And that's an open question for any of the panelists who might like to address that.
If I can reverse that really quickly, not just talking about the people oppressed by these ideologies, regimes, but the coalition of the power, the coalition of white supremacy, that Israel has become the crown jewel of white supremacy, right? That globally, white supremacists see themselves as vested in Israel's final game, right? that if you can obliterate a people, if you can obliterate a culture, right? If you can literally remove people from their land, if you can mass murder them from their land, that is so inspiring, for lack of a better word, in terms of what the end game is for all white supremacist regimes, right? So the fact that it is an ethno state is aspirational for so many other regimes that support it, right? The fact that it has complete disregard for international law, and that international law organizations have complete disregard for policing it, is aspirational for these regimes. And so, the tie-in for me is beyond the coalition of who this regime oppresses. It is the real threat of what this means when you can coalesce a white supremacist ethno state that now is symbolic for all fascist regimes and represents their expansion into all of these regions.
I would just quickly say that there's a tremendous amount of aspiration in the United States to emulate Israeli political structures and policies. We just saw the defeat of Orban, where kind of a similar aspiration exists still on the U.S. right wing, in the fascist right in the United States. And I think that this is even stronger, perhaps, in Israel, as Saida was just saying. I mean, if you think about what the Israeli state looks like, not just ethno-nationalists, which obviously Zionism is ethno-nationalism, but beyond that, it is fundamentally, structurally racist, and that first and second class citizenship structure is an apartheid structure. It is a racist structure, equivalent in certain ways, not in every way, obviously, to what Jim Crow was in the United States. Israel is a major surveillance state. Their idea is the policy of the country is to watch everyone, to keep track of everyone, to use AI and other high-tech means to do that. Surveillance is ramping up in the United States in an extremely fundamental way. And Israel is a concentration camp state. It's a torture state. Israel trains U.S. police in how to torture people. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, has been a fundamental player, fundamental broker of training U.S. police forces all around the country, from top to bottom. I don't know the number, but I think it's at least tens of thousands of police who, I may be wrong, who have been sent to Israel, funded by the ADL and its donors. There's also the AIPAC structure was interfering in really horrendous ways in U.S. Democratic and electoral politics. We can go on with this list. We must not import the Israeli political system into the United States. A lot of people want to do that.
I want to jump in here and also say that, and one of someone in the Q&A mentioned, Lebanon and Yemen. And I think that that's a crucial point. And I'm sorry for your loss. I think the person mentioned having lost family members. Israel is creating a blueprint, to echo what Saida was saying. It's a blueprint not just for ethnostates, but for a new type of warfare, for a horrific new level of state violence and state surveillance. And we've already seen the effects of it. I mean, in Lebanon, the attacks that have been happening for the last 2 weeks, I mean, Israel's history in Lebanon is just absolutely horrendous and has been for decades. It has invaded Lebanon over and over and over and over. And these latest attacks, the massacre that happened after the ceasefire, that was the so-called ceasefire that was announced with Iran, that it was a horrendous massacre, and it was there to, appease this like bloodlust that exists in Israeli society, this need to continue to be at war, as a way to maintain Benjamin Netanyahu's career. But also we saw that the pattern, the type of warfare, the attacking of hospitals, of schools, of desalination plants, the constant attack on the things that make life possible, the brazen contravention of international law, right? Israel is destroying whatever remnant there was of any kind of, legal system for warfare, which, arguably has never been very effective. But this is just so brazen. And we've already, in the United States, seen the effects of this. The Israeli surveillance technology that has been tested on Palestinians is now being used by ICE to track protesters, to track detractors. So this, the weaponry of surveillance is being, exported. So there's these two things that are happening that are extremely scary. This version of warfare that immediately attacks all the systematic means of life, and this elevating of the state's capacity to surveil us, to curb our dissent, to follow us around. It is actually terrifying, and so much of it is developed within Israeli universities. It is not just, Israeli tech sector and Israeli universities and Israeli military technology are deeply, deeply, deeply intertwined. So it's not like we are, this constantly comes up. We are not boycotting these, these random sweet academics. Like we are, or we are boycotting institutions that are at war with us and with the world.
Yes, thank you for those answers, Iman. That's such an important point, kind of tying back to the question of boycotting Israeli universities and their role, right? Deeply complicit and connected to the networks of corporate and military surveillance companies that are developing new technologies of warfare and new strategies for containing, controlling, and eliminating unwanted populations, right? And that all of that is aspirational. I think that those are really crucial points that all of you made. So thank you for bringing us to that. I want to come back to that question of academic boycotts. There was a question in the chat, in the Q&A, about South Africa and the South African boycott movement, and kind of what were its focuses and what was the role of academic boycotts within that broader movement. Okay, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I would say there are two crucial differences between the South African and the Israeli case here, because first of all, the particularly the English universities tended to be, not that they weren't benefiting from apartheid and involved in it, but there was nothing like what was just described with the Israeli universities. And there were also, it was widely recognized in the anti-apartheid movement that there were academics in South Africa who were actively involved in the anti-apartheid movement within the country and taking real risks. And I mean, I know a retired law professor who spent years in prison. There were real people who were really engaged. Another difference, which I've never quite known how to think about it for Palestine, but the ANC, by the 1980s, especially when the anti-apartheid movement globally was really becoming increasingly powerful, the ANC was really the main spokesman for the external anti-apartheid movement. Not that there weren't lots of exiles who weren't in the ANC, but so they basically had a process that people who were, for example, scholars who were invited to give a talk in South Africa could check with the ANC about whether this was okay, which, meant that sometimes there were really good connections made between activists outside and activists inside. And that was important. And then there were major academics who broke the rules, didn't get permission, went to do a graduation speech. Conor Cruz O'Brien famously got booed every time he spoke in Ireland ever. I mean, there was a lot of stigma attached to people who broke the boycott, but if you had permission, it was okay. People coming out, same thing. People who were known to be activists were welcomed around the world to speak at sociology conferences as well as at universities. So I don't think it's the parallels to Israel confused me a little, but I was thinking as people were talking that it was also really important that the boycott um, forced even people who are apolitical to think about whether they really wanted to keep on living in an isolated state. And I actually think that was a really important pressure on particularly the business community, that as boycotts became more visible, they started wondering whether did they really want to continue this way or were they going to have to change things. And I actually see that already happening in Israel, just because I think there's so much anger. People run into so much anger around the world that Israelis who might be apolitical are maybe beginning to think things have gone too far.
Can I raise another thing about racism in this context, especially U.S. racism? It is striking to me that as I mentioned, that the Trump administration is going after universities for quote unquote anti-Semitism. I think this is not really even particularly concerned with anti-Semitism, however you define that concept or that praxis. I think it's really concerned with curtailing and cutting back on civil rights and anti-racism generally on campus. It's notable that accompanying those attacks are the tremendous assaults on what is come to be called DEI and all of that. The idea that Black studies, Latino studies, et cetera, are somehow, and also, by the way, gender studies, LGBTQ studies, that these are somehow discriminatory against white people, straight people, et cetera, against men. The fact that the university is being forced and complying to such an extensive degree with these racist measures, these racist rollbacks, it is all justified and grounded in civil rights law. In Title VI, which people fought, and of the Civil Rights Law of 1964, which people fought and died for trying to create an anti-discrimination commitment, an anti-racist commitment on the U.S. federal level. That this is the most outrageous thing for me to see, that Harvey Dillon and these people are using the issue of anti-Semitism to attack Black people, people of color, gay and trans people, and women.
To footnote that, and that white evangelicals who have fought against desegregation at every turn are so adamantly pro-Israel.
and also sometimes anti-Semitic at the same time.
But that's actually the end game. I mean, I think a lot of us have heard this by now. Their end game is that the second coming of Christ will happen when the kingdom of Israel is on earth, not just in
Armageddon, yeah.
heaven. And then apparently all the Jews will either, burst into flames or they'll be converted. That's the end game. And
Right,
then
and
Netanyahu goes and speaks at their banquets.
right, this is what the great replacement theory is all about. How the Jews are enabling Black folk and other people of color to take over the United States. But we love Israel.
And we also love those Afrikaner refugees. Don't forget that.
Yeah, but
Can I speak to this question that just popped up in the chat, or would that derail things, Andy?
Please do, go for it.
So Blue Buchanan asks for over 400,000 trans and non-binary people have been displaced within the US because of our current political regime. I'm wondering if folks could speak to how the stance ASA has taken around the Palestine resolution could also lay the groundwork for silence and complicity around trans genocidal practices and policies here in the United States. And I just really wanted to amplify that comment and that question because I think this is crucial, right? It is absolutely about Palestine and Lebanon and Yemen and Iran and all of these places, but it is also not just about that. It is about being able to actually use the spaces that belong to us to take a stance about the things that matter to us. And the reality is that this complicity paves the way. This non-democracy paves the way for non-democracy and complicity on other things that matter as well. And we've been seeing that in US institutions, right? Like we've seen that over and over and over, and we've seen it going all the way back. I mean, even further than, often Muslims will say, all of the 9/11, post 9/11 acts and repressions ended up coming back to harm the general American public. They ended up being used against protesters. They ended up being used against freedom of speech, against so many things. But those go even further back to the repressions that were happening against the Black Power movement. It didn't start with 9/11. It didn't start with Muslims. And so what we know is that when we allow these things to happen, they are going to happen to more and more people. And I want to point to this kind of counter petition that was signed by a handful of folks that said, we support this decision to overthrow this member-led petition. And they said, oh, this is a complex issue. And we're seeing this. I don't know if y'all are seeing this at your university, but we are seeing this in the crackdown in Chicago universities, where anything that is seen as controversial, anything that is seen as likely to evoke right-wing response is being quoted as too complex for us to take a stance, even though as scholars we know we have an analysis on these things. Just because there's a second opinion doesn't mean it's equally correct, right? There are people who believe that climate change isn't real. Are we going to treat that like it's a complex issue despite the facts being clearly on one side? So this issue of complexity is going, what we're facing as university administrators, and unfortunately also professional association leadership, trying to act like anything that has controversy, anything in which there may be people who stand on the other side, cannot be decided on by scholarly consensus, cannot be the subject of democracy. It is precisely those things that should be up for democratic debate. It is precisely those things that should be in the marketplace of ideas with us debating them. And so I think it is absolutely true that if we set a precedent on this, we will see it come back. And we are likely to see it come back against trans siblings. And who knows who's going to be next on the chopping block? Who knows?
And to the point you made in your opening remark, the hypocrisy around Ukraine, many of our universities, much of the private sector, right, was decidedly, when it came to that occupied state, right, was decidedly openly expressive. And there was no complication of that issue around Ukraine, right? There was no unpacking of any of that geopolitics as, oh, this is, it's a long history. And so the hypocrisy that we can do that, right, with European nations, but not with this issue is stark and telling.
Yeah, thanks for all of these points. I'd like to stick with this and come back to a point that Iman was making kind of in the opening comments around kind of that everybody I think was making about what does it take to make this organization, the American Sociological Association, relevant in this current moment, right? And what does it mean to be able to have those important to confront these important issues that are driving the conversations and that aren't afraid, right, to tackle the questions like Palestine, or and recognizing, as Iman was saying, that it often stands in as a gateway for further attacks, right, on democracy, on participation, on communities that are vulnerable. And so, in this moment, right, what is it going to take to transform the American Sociological Association, to transform this organization? And I want to come back to a question that Gay raised in the opening comments, and that I think we've seen versions of it through the Q&A about, like, what is the strategy, right? What does it mean to call for a boycott of the American Sociological Association annual meeting? Are we giving up power, right? How do we kind of see this as not just a way of making issues visible, but really, claiming structural power? And that's something that, organizers within Sociologists for Palestine have been thinking a lot about. And it's clear that a lot of folks here on the panel and participants, attendees listening have been thinking about, like, how do we exercise power to effectively transform the association, to hold on to democracy and create space for members to shape the direction of the organization moving forward. So I'd like to turn the conversation back to the question of the boycott of the American Sociological Association, right? That ASA, the Sociologists for Palestine, has put on the table and that we're organizing for. And maybe we can just kind of start that conversation by seeing if anybody wants to speak to that question of kind of structural power versus making issues visible, and what role a boycott of the association can play in leading towards transformation.
Well, one, I think we have a history. I mean, some of our other sociological organizations were formed in response to and departure from ASA. So we do have this history. This is, ASA has been around since since it was called ASS. So this is, the idea that there have been fractures and that there have been calls for divestment of personnel, divestment of fees, all that has happened before. It is why we have some of our most leftists. I think this is the history of triple SP, is it not? But with that, when I saw Alden Morris ask a question in the chat about, like, what our end game is, one, I really appreciate S4P, even in these nascent stages, of really thinking pragmatically and logistically about, like, how this can be done, right? And really not just like a, rah-rah into the night, but really thinking about how do we do this in ways that both preserve our power, concentrate our power, right, and that amplify it. But I do want to open that up to the floor in terms of what we want our end game to be. Is it the adoption of the resolution in terms of putting that to the membership's vote, or are we actually now adding something, onto it? Are we adjusting our end game past the initial resolution?
Very important question. I think it's absolutely important to focus on the ASA itself, and it's clear. I use the word cowardice, and cowardice is significant here. I mean, in the state of Florida, for example, sociology has been virtually banned from the college campuses. So we're going beyond the attacks on DEI and Black students and Black studies and so on to actually attacking whole disciplines. I think the response to that of cowering is exactly the wrong response. But I think that and the power of boards of trustees and regents and so on, who are solidly pro-Israel, are major forces pushing the organization to the right wing and to this repressive and anti-democratic posture. I would like to add one other thing that we haven't brought up yet, and that is our students. Andy actually brought up a vast number of American, a vast chunk of American opinion has turned against Israel. If that has happened, one major reason is because of the action of our students. And the encampments, of course, have been incredibly demonized and repressed, and the attacks on leaders like Mahmoud Khalil and others have been highly publicized. But I really think we have to call on our colleagues to stand up for their students and not to repudiate their positions, their convictions, for opportunistic reasons. And we need to connect with organizing efforts among students. The one that I'm involved with, Jewish Voice for Peace, is just one of those, but there are many others. All the Students for Justice in Palestine chapters that have been repressed, many of them canceled. All of those groups and many other organizations that are not identified along racial or ethnic lines, but might include other less organizations, DSA, other organizations like that. And by the way, especially I think organizations of people of color. All these groups have attempted to challenge this consensus, but it's through the students that we can pressure our colleagues, and through our colleagues that we can challenge the despotic rule of the university's boards of trustees, the finance capital people, the hedge fund managers and so on who sit on our boards. And of course, these people are extremely powerful because they control the purse strings, but they cannot run a university without their faculty and without their students.
Yeah, thank you all for that. When Sociologists for Palestine asked for people's feedback on what more could be done, right, to try to transform the ASA in this moment, we've heard so many calls for various forms of escalation, including right the idea of mass resignation from the ASA, which has been here in the Q&A as well, of elected positions, of membership altogether. And you know, it speaks to the fact that people are angry, right? Angry at the attack on democracy, angry at a member resolution, the leadership just simply not allowing us to vote, right, on a member resolution, whether or not people support the resolution itself, to have the opportunity to follow the bylaws and to participate in a member election. And clearly, right, we saw when the ballot came out this morning, and we all opened it up to see whether or not the resolution was going to be on there, and we saw that it was not. Right, it was clear that the ASA leadership is either not hearing us or they don't care. Right, they have other priorities that they think are more important than the voices of members. But people are upset, right, and I think that, you know, I just want to speak to for a minute to the question that Gay raised of like, what does it take to try to create real change, right? To try to create real change within the ASA. So Sociologists for Palestine had deep conversations about this, and the strategy that we landed on was to boycott the meetings, right? To boycott the ASA meeting this summer, by not paying registration fees and not staying in the block of hotel rooms, right, chosen and selected by the ASA leadership. And this was a decision not to withdraw from the organization, but to continue to remain engaged in the organization, right? That we weren't ready to walk away from the ASA because we want to transform this organization. We don't want to give up control of the organization to lawyers, to people who, you know, want to suppress, right, engagement and democracy and political commitments on the part of the membership, but rather to continue to engage and to participate. And the boycott strategy that we have outlined here, right, is specifically, right, one of the things that we keep hearing from the ASA leadership is about fiduciary responsibility, the fiduciary responsibility of the board, right? We cannot take political stances because membership will decline, because we will, right, face other kinds of threats to that would undermine the fiduciary responsibility of the board. But we want them to understand how angry people are, right? And I think that they will see that. We have over 550 people have already signed a pledge not to participate in the ASA meetings this summer and not to stay at the ASA hotels. That's tens of thousands of dollars, right? That will have an immediate impact, if not more. We haven't done all the math yet, but that's only in 3 weeks, right? This has been 4 weeks at this point since that March 12th letter. There's still 3 more months before the ASA meetings. There are ways for the ASA to change course, right? There are still opportunities for the council to vote on BDS, for the council to call a special election, to put another ballot before the members to vote on this. There's opportunities for the council to put forward a bylaw amendment that gets rid of this ambiguity, which is being intentionally weaponized to shut down democratic participation. So the boycott, right, is in the way that we've envisioned it, is a moment of leverage on the leadership, but also a commitment to remain engaged and to continue to participate, right? It doesn't preclude the possibility of other escalations, whether that be protests in New York, whether that be, you know, resignation or withdrawal of labor by elected officials and editors and various other, right, members who play such a key role in keeping the organization going. Right now, the end game is is twofold. It is, right, to pass an institutional boycott of Israeli universities and to reinforce the democracy of the American Sociological Association by amending the bylaws to make clear that members have, right, the power to participate in shaping the direction of the organization. So that's where we are. We're coming down to the end of this webinar. We have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to invite each of our participants to our panelists again to thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom and your brilliance with us today. But also just want to give each of you an opportunity to share any kind of closing thoughts for about a minute as we move towards wrapping up.
I will say, as a note of fuel for our tanks, one, we do know that ASA is in at a very belt tightening point. So to hit them in the finances absolutely is effective. But here's our fuel. You don't put things to a vote when you know they're not going to go your way. They knew this was not going to go their way, right? You do not put things to Democratic votes when you know you will not win them, right? That's a tried and true political strategy. And so, if anything, that should be really our momentum, that, the comparison of ASA to like the Democratic Party, you are not responding to your membership, to your rank and file, right? They know that. I'm not sure what they feel like they're protecting, if that means like, I'm like, are they afraid that DeSantis is going to wipe out all the intro requirements? And like, I'm not actually sure what their sort of interest is, or what sort of APAC sponsored book forum we have. I'm confused, but I do know that they are afraid of exactly that, the leanings of their membership.
I think, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I just feel, really grateful for all of you and for folks who engaged with us in the Q&A. To answer your questions, one of the questions was how many people were here. And I think at the top I saw 180 something. And I'm sure people were in and out. I think that at the end of the day, we live under capitalism, and the only thing that we really have under capitalism is our labor, unless we have capital, which most of us don't. And our labor is going, this is our labor. And so this organization is built on our labor. Our universities are built on our labor. And so this question of where does our labor go, and does it entitle us to make political decisions, to be political actors, is a question about who, is an existential question. And so I think, this is about taking the right moral stance. This is about also taking ownership of our work, of alienating us a little bit less in this moment. And I just want to end by saying that this is a political campaign. And some of the comments that have come in, and I think for academics, we often struggle to turn off sort of analysis mode and go into political campaign, political strategy mode. And so the question isn't the purity of the politics, or the purity of the moment. It's how do we work with the resources that we have to advance a goal, to move ourselves forward, to try to have a material impact on the people of Palestine, of Lebanon, of Iran, of all the places that are suffering from Israel's aggression and oppression. And so that takes a different lens than trying to sort of just theorize all of this in the abstract. I just wanted to remind all of us of this, and finally just thank all of our friends and in Sociologists for Palestine. Thank you for all the work that you're doing and for bringing us together.
I would just say that it's really important, always important politically and even professionally. If we look back at the history of sociology and the interventions of Alvin Goldner and people like that who criticized bystander sociology and, positivist distancing from the actual consequences of the things, dynamics of the things we study. But above everything else, it's important as politically to organize where you are, not somewhere else. Where we are is two places. We're in a professional association that has lost its rudder, is flailing, is uncertain of what it's about and where it's headed. And a lot of that is political. A lot of that is a reaction to the right-wing drifts of the American political scene. And the other place we are, even more important, much more important in my opinion, is in the university. The university is one of the few major institutions in the society that even now, to some extent still, resists occupation, resists deracination, resists evisceration by repressive anti-democratic forces. We have to work in our universities, in our departments, in our universities, and as I say, with our students. Our students are on our side. Our sociology majors are on our side. At my university, we have the largest major. We have about 2,000 sociology majors at the University of California, Santa Barbara. They come to us for a reason. And they, of course, they're diverse in terms of every factor and obviously politically diverse as well. But they are, in general, outraged at the U.S. support of Israel, at the University of California's slavish support of Israel, at the power of the regents to repress opposing opinions. They're doing research projects on the board of regents, on the regents themselves. We can encourage that. So, I mean, in all these ways to support our students, as well as fighting in the university in so many other ways, is important.
I just want to thank everyone for being here. Was an amazing, you guys were amazing. The questions were amazing. Andy, thank you so much for helping organize this and sharing it. And thanks to the other organizers. And I keep thinking about all the times I've heard anti-apartheid people talk about they never thought they could win until they won.
Perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Gay. Thank you, Howie, Iman, Saida. And thanks to all the attendees. We really appreciate you being here. And please look for further opportunities to continue to engage and to support the struggle for a free Palestine and a democratic ASA. Thank you, everyone.